So you want to grow a garden in a small suburban space? Let me show you how. How much can you really do in a suburban context? If you want to garden in your backyard, what kind of things do you need to think about? I live on a 1/4 of an acre in typical suburbia. Most of that 1/4 acre is taken up by a house. But you can see, well, there's a lot going on back here. If you want to garden in suburbia, what are the things you need to think about when planning your space? Today I want to give you 5 things to consider in the planning stages of gardening. We're not going to go into all the specific crops, the kinds of soil mixtures, the fertilization. All that's for later. You got to think about some things up front before you begin gardening. That will help you maximize your production and will streamline your whole garden operation, even in a little yard like this. So when establishing a brand new garden in a new space, the first thing you want to do is what I call a sun survey or a shade survey. What you want to do is sketch out your property and identify where your shade falls in the morning and in the evening, and follow that shade as the sun transits across your property, and identify those places where you're going to be able to have, at a bare minimum, 6 to 8 hours of sunshine, and that's where you might put your garden. Even better is if you can get a full day of sun, 10 hours, 12 hours, that's ideal. And so that's the first thing you want to do. I'll give you an example by taking a look at my own property. I have these trees here. These trees cast a lot of shade. My neighbor's trees cast shade, and my house, which is tall right there and short over here, it casts shade as well. So I have to study that, and I used to have a garden right here where all this mess is over here. And I had that garden and it performed well when these trees were small. Once they grew up, nothing would grow there. So I moved over to this side of the yard. And over here in the winter, you can see that about half that garden gets a lot of filtered sunlight, but that works for winter crops. And in the summer, the shade comes literally to about right there at the edge of that garden bed. And yeah, I get a lot of sun over here. So basically this area right here that you see, from here to there, that is my usable space for effective gardening. So you can see just over the course of a few hours since I began my video, the shade has progressed this way, and eventually at the end of the day, my whole garden obviously will be shaded out by my house. I considered my sun and shade combinations, and I found that I had a strip on the north side of my property running all along between my house and my neighbor's house. Currently it's in shade right now because in the winter time the sun shifts in the sky, so you have to be mindful of where the sun is in different seasons. But in the growing season, in the spring and summer, this strip gets almost full sun all day long. From over there all the way to over there, that's the transit of the sun. And so I put in a grapevine in just this this thin little area. This doesn't take up but 2 or 3 feet width, thickness, but it's 40 or 50 feet long, and that's a good way to make good use of limited space. Even in suburbia, I can grow some grapevines. So when you're establishing a new garden, you want to think about all those kinds of shadows and how they're going to impact your vegetable garden, and how they're going to limit your sunlight. Having done a sun and shade survey on your property and determined where the best place is to put a garden, you'll want to next to figure out what kind of garden beds do I want. Do I want raised beds? Do I want to just till up the ground and put in a traditional garden there? What kind of garden do I want? That's going to be determined a lot by your soil type and the kind of work, or even your budget. The benefits of a raised bed like these here. Raised beds allow you to garden virtually on any kind of soil. You can even I've seen people do raised beds on concrete driveways. The benefit of a raised bed is you're building on top of your native ground, and you're in control of what you're putting in that bed. The downside to a raised bed is the upfront cost in bringing in materials to build a raised bed. But if you can fill a raised bed for a couple $100 and get that thing going, you can get it going right away. You can plant right into it. If you're going to till up your ground, if you've got fertile soil, that's a great option, and that's the cheapest option. The trade-off is that it involves a lot more work and possibly some time if you need to amend those beds and get the soil prepared. A raised bed like this lets you garden right away. You can get things in the soil as soon as you fill your raised bed. You don't have to have borders on a raised bed. You can just pile up soil and garden in that. But I like the tidiness of having borders, and I like the pathways that I can put in my garden that give me a lot of joy just to walk down my paths in my garden. These paths were designed so that I could fit my lawnmower in between my garden beds, but you don't have to do that. If you have narrower paths, you get more growing space. Also, the borders on my gardens take up quite a bit of space. They are, 8 inches, 10 inches wide. They do have holes I can grow in, but if I really wanted to maximize my gardening space, I wouldn't use borders at all like this, or I could use traditional wooden borders. The only problem with that is they rot away in about 5 to 6 years. Even treated lumber is not going to last very long. These will last longer than me, but they do take up some space. Now, if I was really pressed for food and we had a difficult time getting food, you never know these days the way the world is going, I would fill in these paths with soil and I would walk along the top of these borders, and I would gain myself 2 feet of growing space, and I'd have several paths worth of growing space to use. And over the years, as the nutrients that go into this garden leach into the soil, they actually do kind of spread out a bit, and all of the wood chips and grass clippings that I've placed in my paths over the years has made that some pretty decent soil. It's not the best stuff, but it's better than the soil over in my yard. So yeah, creative thinking, you can actually maximize quite a bit of space even in a small garden like this. If you choose to go the in-ground garden route, if you make your bed out of your native soil, I strongly suggest you get a soil test, and this will help you to determine what your soil lacks in terms of nutrition and mineralization. And you take that test, especially if you've got a local extension office, they can help you determine what your soil needs. That's beyond the scope of this video in terms of nutrition. You can follow my channel for all kinds of videos about composting, about mineralization, about fertilization, but you do want to know up front what you've got. You also want to know if your soil is well draining. My native soil is not well draining at all. In fact, underneath this first few inches of topsoil is nothing but black gumbo clay, hence the name of my channel. I can't really garden easily in this clay without a whole lot of work, a whole lot of amendments, and so that's why, for my context, I've chosen raised beds. Makes sense for me. It might not make sense for you. You might be blessed with excellent soil, but a soil test is a good step when you're establishing a new garden. Having determined what kind of garden you're going to put in, whether that be a raised bed or traditional garden, whatever it is, the next thing you need to think about is, how do I orient my garden beds? How do I orient my rows if I'm doing a traditional tilled garden? How do I orient my raised beds in terms of where the sun's going to fall? Let's talk about how to orient a garden bed. I've chosen to orient my garden beds east to west. That's east, that's west, that's south, and that's north. And the reason I've chosen this way is I want to maximize the sun as it transits over my property. And so if the sun comes up in the east and it goes over my property this way, it's perpendicular to the way I've arranged my beds, east to west. And the reason for that is I want the sun to cover my plants as much as possible. If I have a very tall crop, say corn, and I put it on the end of my bed here, and I put radishes next to my corn, and then next to it I put some okra. Okra is very tall. If the sun transits across longitudinally on my bed, those small plants are going to be in the shade. Those radishes are going to be in the shade almost all day long. They're only going to get sun when the sun is directly overhead. If I go this way, however, and I've got long, narrow beds, then the plants get more of the sun, and I don't shade out as much as my garden that way. Same thing goes with orienting your rows in a traditional garden bed. You want to orient your rows in a way that maximizes the sun. For me, and in my context, and with the challenges of shade that I have all around me, it makes sense to orient my beds this way. So that's Something you want to think about when you're doing your sun survey of your property is how do you want to orient your crops so that they don't shade one another out. I've not really maximized my growing space as much as I possibly could. I have luxury paths is what I call them. They're broad, wide paths through my garden beds. They're wide enough for me to get the lawnmower through. But if I was really pressed for food production, I would fill those paths in and I would grow in those. And I would almost gain 1/3 of of my garden space by growing in the paths. And so maximizing your garden space has to do with how closely you want your paths to be. Do you want to pass a lawnmower down there, or do you just want a 12-inch path that you can walk on? You have to think about those things. For me, currently in this context, well, I like the luxury of being able to stroll down my paths and put the lawnmower down there. Maximizing space also has to do with increasing your productivity by using alternative methods to just a bed. I put in lots of container plants in my garden, and I use my pathways and the borders of my garden bed to place containers. And so I can move those around. I can give them more sun by placing them in different spots. I can make use of parts of my yard that I haven't planted with permanent garden beds. And that's one way I can maximize my production using containers. If we're talking about maximizing production, then some of the things that I'm doing in my particular context are not the thing you want to do. I grow a lot of fruit trees in pots. Well, container gardening is a way to maximize your growing space. I keep my fruit trees small. That's a way to maximize the number of trees I can have on my property. The problem is the fruit trees that I grow mostly are fig trees, and fig trees kept small are not real heavy producers. If you want to maximize food production and your purpose for gardening is to impact your bottom line and to provide food for your family in bulk, then fig trees probably aren't the thing for you. You'll want to grow things that are high in production, that have a high calorie content, and that are reliable crops. And those are going to differ from region to region. So that's when you need to be studying what grows in your area, talking to other gardeners, talking to farmers, and finding out what they grow. And find out what does well in your soil and in your climate. You always want to check with your local extension office or get online and find out what hardiness zone you live in, because that will determine some planting skills that you'll need as you go and sow your garden. That's for a different video, but you have to keep these things in mind when you're planning for food production and maximum productivity. Is what crops are you going to grow? Your extension office can help you with that, but I'll give you an example. If I was to try to maximize my food production on my property, I wouldn't be growing these figs. I wouldn't grow tomatoes. I would grow things that produce a lot of fruit for the space. Things like cowpeas, things like cucumbers, things like squashes. Here, in this context, those things are heavy producers. And if you're growing food for feeding your family and dropping your grocery bill, perhaps in a suburban context, corn is not even something you want to grow. You get 1, maybe 2 ears of corn per plant, and you have to plant a lot of corn to get a successful and reliable fertilization. So corn's not an option. So things like beans, things like peas, things like lima beans, heavy producers are good for a small garden context if you're trying to impact your bottom line. Greens, very, very high production. Greens can be harvested throughout the season. Greens like these bok choys and that tatsoi is a very good option if you're trying to grow some food that will keep producing for a while. Root crops. Root crops are frequently very good producers in terms of bulk. Beets, like the beets I've got growing over there, are efficient crops because you can eat the greens and you can eat the tube, the roots, and the roots store very well. So that's a nice long-term crop. Carrots. Carrots are a high-density crop. You can grow a lot of carrots in a small space. And so we've got some carrots over there, and that's a very good crop if you're trying to produce a lot of food. A lot of nutrition in that too. Here's a crop that you might consider, but you might not. These are cabbages. Cabbages take up a lot of space. That's half of my garden bed sown in cabbages. Well, I'm only going to get 8 heads of cabbage there. But in our context, well, we like cabbage, and cabbage can be preserved for a long time as sauerkraut, as kimchi. Cabbage is a good storage crop, but it takes a long time to grow and it takes up a lot of space. So these are the considerations you have to make when you're planning your garden beds. Here are some good ideas for storage crops. These are sweet potatoes. And yeah, they don't look like the ones that come from the store because I'm not sorting out the ugly ones. We're going to eat those. Pumpkins. Pumpkins can store all winter long. Winter squashes, that's why they're called winter squashes. You grow them in the summer, you harvest them in the fall, and they last all winter. Beans, these are cowpeas. These are purple hull cowpeas. And these, while dried, will last almost indefinitely. So you can harvest a whole bunch of cowpeas, dry them, just let them dry on your countertop like this, then shell them, and they store almost forever. The final consideration when starting a new garden in a small space is, even though it's a small space, gardening's work. And you don't want to bite off more than you can chew right off the bat and discourage yourself with too much work or failure because you couldn't keep up with it. You're trying to learn new things. So I would encourage you to start with maybe a small bed, maybe the standard kind of raised bed size they suggest is a 4x8, maybe one or two of those. But you want to put in a garden bed that you can manage. These beds are just about all that I can manage in any given year. And towards the end of each growing season, these beds get full of weeds, and especially these holes along the borders. If I've not planted something specifically in that particular hole, every single one of those holes grows lots of weeds. And it's difficult to get in there with a tool or with your hands and pull weeds out of that compacted soil there. So yeah, this is about all I can manage right now on my own in my context. Well, there's a very brief look at what you can actually do in a small space. I hope that my little humble garden here inspires you to maybe do something with your backyard, and you might take up gardening, whether it's just for the pleasure of growing plants or whether it's to impact your grocery bill. You can do a lot with a small space. If you want to learn how to garden and do all these various kinds of things, please subscribe to my channel. We're aiming for 100,000 subscribers this spring, and we're almost there. It would be great to have you on board. Hey, thanks for joining us today. Y'all have happy gardening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.